Charles,
Okay.
welcome.
So I'm going to start today by sharing a PowerPoint that will permit me to talk about the general concepts of race that have emerged over time, and to trace a bit some of the intersections historically where architects have read about, learned about, and or assimilated these thoughts into their work. And then I want to talk a bit through some of the concepts of Blackness that have been explored by certain rubrics in the humanities. And all this is a way of preparing you to do a kind of building case study, an impromptu building case study. And looking over the examples, I mean, I did make some recommendations to Mira over email, but I actually think that a building designed by Erdy McHenry and Associates, entitled the Southern Poverty Law Center, their new design for that building in Alabama, would be a really good case study. So I'm going to ask you guys to think about this presentation and think about the concepts of Blackness that we review, and then try and apply that in the ways that you might read this particular building case study online. So let me share my screen here and sort of get started with this. Let's see. So one of the courses that I teach routinely is called Race and Place, and it really asks students to think about how it is that race intersects with placemaking, both in terms of people's abilities to create a sense of place for themselves, sometimes consciously from the community level, but oftentimes unconsciously through the use of policies, policymaking decisions, through the use of uneven development, etc. How do these two things intersect with one another, one being an historical idea, originating at least in the ways that we understand it today from the 18th and 19th century sciences of biology and racial anthropology. And how do we understand it today and use that new understanding to reassess its meaning in the past? So what was race in the past? And I'd like to at least provide everybody with an opportunity here to respond. What do you think race was in the past? Or do you understand this term to mean? We use this term again and again and again. I think it's good to clarify what we mean by it and to define them as much as possible. So let me see if I can actually look at the participant box. Yeah, I'm a fan of you just unmiking yourself and telling me what it is that you think during this part of the presentation.
Race was sort of a way of categorizing people. Like, it wasn't a set thing, like it was something that was always sort of being changed and like constructed based off of like what society was during a specific time.
Okay. So your understanding of it is contextual, based on what the needs were of either the nation state or the scientists or those who were making the definition. Okay, that's good. What else do we think race was? How do you guys understand this term?
It was maybe like a signifier of like location of origin. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so some people, you're saying, use it to signify where someone might have come from, either them or their relatives. I have a question in the chat box saying, how long ago? I'm really thinking about the definition of race in the post-Enlightenment era. So in the late 18th century, early 19th century, when folks in natural philosophy, the beginnings of biology are starting to think about race. This would be different than the use of the term in, say, Vitruvius's books of architecture, where he thinks about race in terms of nation or national group, although that would sort of fold over into this notion of race. Let me sort of advance here. So in this time period that I'm talking about, late 18th, early 19th century, race was a scientific category people invented to make sense of human variety. So the two responses that I got really do touch on some of the definitions here. There's a sense that in the scientific community, there is a building of consensus or toward consensus of how to make sense of the different groups of people that Europeans are discovering as they explore the world. both in terms of literally just visiting other places, but also for the purposes of colonization. And so in the process of colonization, both the study of human biology, but also of human cultures, led people to strategize about what decisions they should be making as they meet these different groups of people. But at this time period, at least, there's a belief that race is based in empirical science. So today, with the study of the human genome and the study of genetic patterns and across racial groups, we understand this not to be true. But in this time period, people believe that race was true, that it was passed on from one generation to the next. They weren't sure whether different races belonged to one human species or whether different races literally constituted different human species. But there was a sense that things like base temperaments of individuals, intellectual capacities, were passed on down from one group to another. And these different groups then were categorized by type. And I'm really interested in the ways that type and type theory was used in biology, because this idea is what was passed from one field in the sciences into architecture. So when we talk about things like a vernacular typology, or when we talk about a building type, we're actually using the language of the natural sciences. And we're employing a logic of categorization that was originated to think about the natural world, but also about human beings. And so this thinking, this terminology emerged within biology, anthropology, and ethnology. Ethnology is sort of the comparison of different civilizational groups. So there's ethnography, which is just the vast study of the environment as a whole and different groups of people. And then once we have a large collection of data, then we can engage in ethnological comparison. And there was this belief, especially by architects like Viollet-le-duc and Gottfried Semper, who I spoke about last night, that if we could just collect enough data about the world, then we'd be able to understand the underlying principles of nature, either through the study of races or through the study of material cultures. And so we would illustrate type forms and type categories. And this was something, a slide that I showed last night, starting with the Linnaean categorizations of the late 18th century, and leading into some of the experiments by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was one of the first people to create a kind of a natural science of mankind, collecting human skulls, literally measuring them and comparing them, and then creating kind of categorization of them across the 5 racial groups that he believed existed in the world. And then on top of this, in ethnography, we started to look from human types, race types, to material cultures and the cultural patterns of groups of people. Race was visually represented by things like skin color, but also by things like skull shape, language, and material culture. And what's interesting about the use of this term is that there isn't as much consensus in the scientific communities as one might think. So for example, linguists would use the term race to distinguish certain language groups. But they started doing this before ethnographers and biologists started using the term to describe human differences. So it was really meant as a kind of metaphor to explain the organic behavior of languages as they morph and change during human migrations across time. Some people would use parts of the skull and argue that they were the most definitive means of identifying difference, so that skin color was sort of incidental, but the shape of the skull or dentition or the shape of the teeth would be most important. Some would follow upon the Linnaean notions by looking at things like hair texture and a combination of factors. But race came to represent many things in that time period. And it's important to understand this because then we get the notion that race was a floating signifier that was really contextual. Just like in the ways that people were trying to assess the meaning of this term, they were also trying to investigate what it was supposed to represent in the past. Now, this is that diagram I was talking about by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, where the skull in the middle And this is going to sound a little creepy, but he thought it was the most beautiful skull of all mankind. He would look at it and imagine, dress it with his eyes in terms of what the person's musculature and skin might have looked like. And he thought it had the most edifying shape, and it indicated for him, more importantly, this remote archetypal man, race of man, which would be traced back in some of the earlier theories as the Aryans, the prototypical Aryans, who would establish the Aryan migration theory through linguistics. And so this person would supposedly move from one region of the world to another. And as they moved to these other regions, the aspects of their body would literally change to fit their context. And over time, what they call these degenerations would lead to permanent changes, like new skin color, like new hair texture based on diet and exposure to the sun and geography, etc. And so this was his way of trying to show the plasticity of the human body as an organic entity that could adapt itself across time. Interestingly, Blumenbach was somebody who was interested in the degrees of difference between humanity. His theory at the end of the 18th century would harden into what would happen to most general type theory categories, which is that they became these kind of reductive, fixed categories for understanding things, a kind of shortcut for understanding what the characteristics were of each place. This notion of geography followed the linguistic theory of Indo-European languages and Aryan migrations. And here's a map kind of showing what some people still continue to study as the evolution of the Indo-European languages into mother tongues and sister languages. Now, what's interesting as we look into architecture is that type theory started to be associated explicitly with race types and vernacular typologies by people like Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-duc. In the lecture yesterday, I showed you guys Viollet-le-duc's reconstruction of histories that led up to essentially the Greek and Roman, and then later the French and British architectural typologies. He was hired by the Russian government after he completed his 10-volume dictionary project to create an architectural history of Russian form. And so he went about using the geometrical tools and the kind of theories of evolution that he used in his previous studies to establish a study on the origins of Russian art. And during this time period, people believed that race was thought to influence things like social mores, intellectual development, and cultural development. This was a scientific way of understanding this. And here's an example that influenced the German architect Gottfried Semper, Gustav Klemm. And this is an example of ethnology now. So now we're looking at different civilizations facing off with one another. But here, as if it were an engine to cultural change and development, what we have are the lighter skinned races and the darker skinned races categorized psychologically as either passive races or active races. And then their conflicts, sometimes resulting in intermarriage, sometimes resulting in suppression or oppression within cultures, would result in then material cultures that would show us what the result of this conflict would become. And so almost in a way that emulates the reproductive dynamics of the human body and the races literally mixing with one another, we get a mixing of cultural typologies. And ethnology was a way of studying this. And if you put yourself back in this time period, so the late 18th century, early to mid 19th century, you have to think of these European nation states starting to come into being. They're starting to define themselves, define their centers, invent narratives that would bring people together as a kind of common culture for each of these groups. And so what was at stake here was to define the center of culture in a way that would clearly identify who were insiders and who were outsiders. This was important not only for the nation state at home, but also for the nation state as they developed colonies. So different European nations would establish standards for the colonies that would range from external subjects within the colonies to confederated subjects, but depending on their racial background, subjects who, because of the limits that nature had imposed upon them, could never fully assimilate fully into the nation state. So this science here of type thinking was important, not just as an inspirational form and not just as a terminological borrowing from one field to another, but it influenced things like national policy, and it influenced things like trade and exchange and governance in these spaces. I did show this image before about the parallel construction of Viollet-le-duc from the Dacius race and the Aryan race and their different architectural typologies. And then as they meet in through cultural conflict and conquest, the creation of a hybridized technology or a hybridized typology that he theorized was actually that contained the same floor plan as houses like the House of the Faun in Rome. So literally anticipating Greek and Roman typologies of the future. Now, over time, particularly as we get to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and fields like racial anthropology give birth to fields like phrenology, which uses the reading of racial or physiognomy to understand someone's internal character. And this would lead to fields like criminal anthropology and notions of things like the mugshot, where the profile of the human figure, not just in terms of the race telling us, or the skull rather, telling us the essential characteristics of the race, but now telling us the modalities of criminality or deviancy, social deviancy, whether it's sexual deviancy or mental derangement, as well as genius within the population. It was a way to both criminalize and to elevate people of certain characteristics. And so we get a period now where people are literally reduced to types. And in the years before we get eugenics becoming not only a kind of interesting parlor game that the British would play amongst themselves when they were bored, but also the basis of social policy, even in the United States, of so far as taking unwed mothers and neutering them, essentially, to make sure that they could no longer propagate within society. We were using this to literally socially engineer our societies. And so this was both a support scientific legitimation of practices like colonialism and racism, segregation in the US, and different types of practices. But from my perspective, the most essential element that I want you guys to think about and to contemplate today is the ways that type categories condition what we see. So instead of being able to see things as they are or to observe things in their natural environment, we come to these environments with type categories in our mind. And these type categories condition how we understand how these entities operate in the built environment. And from my perspective, and in the research that I do both in design studios and in history courses, I challenge students to explicitly identify in their minds what elements of a building typology that they have in their mind are absolutely essential to the ways that spaces were understood by those who resided in them, and what elements of that space get erased by the reductive diagrams that we have called typologies. And I would do this exercise with things like the shotgun house. And there's a really excellent essay written by John Michael Vlach, who's a folk historian. He traces the evolution of the shotgun house from Yoruban tribes in West Africa over into French-controlled Haiti, where that typology was brought over by Africans who were enslaved for the French, as well as produced independently by a local tribe of Arawak Indians. And the evolution of the Haitian form as they adopted the French mortise and tenon connections and changed the tectonic details of the building, but continued to evolve and preserve some of the social practices that originated in Africa. And then after the Haitian Revolution, where the slaves revolted and established their own independent state, then the migration of this form into the United States in places like New Orleans, where now you have a simultaneous settling of both Africans who were brought over as slaves, still practicing some of the antique construction techniques of the Yoruban shotgun house, and then the new techniques that were brought over by freed Black Haitians who came in as craftsmen and constructed new homes for lower middle class and middle class Black residents living in New Orleans. So you had a rich culture, which included migrants from a freed state, so those who were brought over as slaves, and then those who were Creoles within that space, all practicing a different culture, but all using the same building form. So how much does that form actually tell us about the distinct cultures and spatial practices in those locations? And then this story gets even more complicated as the shotgun house moves from New Orleans and is disseminated by developers into the American South as a kind of mass-produced typology for low-income, first-time home owners. And so all of these different cultures inhabited in these spaces, but the building form tended to stay pretty similar. So how is it that the typology itself, the diagram of the building with the porch and the lined up doorways between these spaces really tells us about what's happening on the inside? How do we recuperate the information about space and spatial practices that we're missing? This is the central question about type and typology. And this is the central question both in terms of how we understand race and the production of stereotypes, but even architecture and the production of vernacular typologies, as we've seen in some of these diagrams, which were heavily associated within the minds of the architects. Just so you get a sense of how this worked in physical anthropology, here's a slide from the anthropologist Petrus Camper. And we call him an anthropologist in a very generous sense. He's sort of like this, in this age of a gentleman philosopher who can do many things simultaneously, one of which was studying anthropology. But he really did this not for scientific means, but for artistic means. He established this notion of the facial angle to help those who were working in the arts to produce realistic representations of the world's racial groups in tableaus of national mythology. So if you had folks who were doing paintings where people from the African colonies were brought together with someone of German descent within this particular national tableau, they could literally use things like facial angles to geometrically capture the essence of these groups. Now this process and procedure would lead to some of the elements of scientific racism, where calipers and different forms of measurement would be used to literally, measure the space between someone's eyes to see if they were more on the scale towards simplistic psychological reasoning. And we see this today even in kind of caricatures of people as we exaggerate the features of people to represent their characters. This is where this comes from. But we can see that, and Camper was another person who was somebody who was a gradualist, who didn't believe in really stark divisions, but his diagrams would be used to support things like the superiority of European races. So here we're looking at a scale that he developed between the facial angles found within nature, between chimpanzees and different natural, I guess we would call technically subhuman species, to the races that seem to be closest to nature, and those would be Africans and Asians. And as we move through the scale, we get closer to the Europeans. But what's interesting is the last element on this chart. And here we're looking at not even a person. This is a statue. And this is a statue of Greek and Roman derivation. And as we know, statues are not real things. But above that statue is a skull, as if we could understand what the structure of the gods would be if we applied scientific rationalization to investigate that hidden structure. And so the angle of the gods was close to almost straight up and down, almost 90 degrees or 100 degrees. And they assumed that the angle of Europeans was 90 degrees. So Europeans came closest to the mythical gods, and Africans and so-called Orientals or Asians came closest to the elements of nature. So you could see how this spectrum could be hijacked to create a hierarchy of spaces, of races, particularly within colonial investigations. And for me, it's really important that art was used as a legitimation of this reasoning. And I consider architecture to operate in terms of its invention of type categories as a form of soft power within this kind of political context and intellectual context. Here are some of the other forms of measurement. I'm just showing you some of the anthropological manuals from this time period. This one written and published by Paul Topinard and Paul Broca. Here's another document or another apparatus, the facial gonimeter. And to me, it really, it reminds me of some of the architectural projects that I've seen certain schools do, where they're trying to invent new geometrical tools for measuring phenomena within nature. And so extending this notion of the ways that geometry and science allow us to be rigorous in particular about how it is that we study what is around us, leads to things like, if unchecked, leads to things like this image on the right, where an incarcerated criminal was dissected after his death in order to give us a sense of what it was that made him, or gave him the proclivities towards criminality. It's the same logic, but the inverse of why it is that we want to preserve the brains of people like Albert Einstein, as if somehow the remains or the geometry or the elements of these people will tell us what makes someone a genius or what makes someone a criminal. And so I'm pointing this to you to kind of give you a sense of what people believed was the explanatory power of type categories, but the danger in over-investing in those categories alone without having some form of check against it. So that is how one understood race in the past, in terms of it being an empirical scientific category, something that was real, something that we needed to invest in, and that would tell us about the character, the internal or hidden character of the individual. What do we think race is today? Today, at least within the broad critique within anthropology and biology and also within humanities, race is understood to be the social construction of difference. Now that we have biological studies that tell us that race is not an empirical fact, we continue to talk about race because we have constructed societies in ways that are racially codified and racially stratified. We understand our group associations and our personal identities through the histories and legacies, not only of race and racial identity, but through racism and the ways that this impacts one's life. It also is a continual factor in measuring the disproportionate economic, social, and health consequences on certain groups over others. Race is, as that would be less efficient than some other elements. And so there is a debate about whether we should still continue to use these categories, whether it continues to reify this notion of racial difference, or if being very conscious about one's use of the term race allows us to address and redress the kind of social sins that have emerged because of it. But I want to emphasize the fact that it is not a scientific fact. It is a cultural process which serves political purposes. Regardless of it not being scientific fact, these social categories do have real consequences. And so just like anything that we believe fictitiously, like, I don't know, when you were 4 or 5 and you believed Santa was real and he brought you stuff and you were really, really happy. And then when you learned that he wasn't real, you still were able to be happy at Christmas time, right? Like you still got gifts and presents and everything else. So the fact that we understand something isn't a scientific fact doesn't change the social dynamics around how that thing works. In this class, I like to talk about the changing definitions of race that are recorded on the census, because this is at least one place within our federal government where we acknowledge the fact that race is no longer biological, it's cultural. But we continue to insist on tracing its effects in our society. And the way that it is framed, most of the time when it asks you, what is your race? It doesn't ask you, what biological group do you belong to? But it asks you, where do you trace your cultural origins, or how do you culturally situate yourself within American society? And so there is this recognition that a social definition of race is still important and changing in time. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the social theorists around the idea of race and the ways that we've come to both critique this notion, but also to nuance what its meaning is for the present, because I'm hoping that this will allow you to take and to transport some of the ideas from the broader humanities into how it is that you understand architecture and architectural production. So the first and probably one of the most canonical notions of race comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, which is his notion of double consciousness, where he's talking about the American Negro as an historical figure or category who understands himself or herself not as an individual in the ways that Americans want to think of all American citizens, but as somebody who is a Black person, and then somebody who understands how the majority group or whites understand them as a Black person. And so they go around with a kind of typological understanding of themselves and an embodied understanding of themselves. And these two things are conflicting with one another to merge and become one thing. And this is how he puts it in his text. He says, the Negro is born with a veil and gifted with a second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideas of one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And so in order to really understand this, I think we have to note several things about Du Bois and also about the US context. So Du Bois is really understanding the place of African Americans in the US as a kind of persistent colonial condition. They're not ever viewed as full citizens. They're never granted the rights and privileges of their white counterparts, because popularly America is understood to be a race of European American citizens or Anglo-American citizens at the time period. And so he would write in his work about race, not from the biological perspective. He tried to counter that by going back to people like Herder, and in our discourse, maybe you would even say someone like Vitruvius, to think about it from a national or civilizational standpoint. So if America has already been defined at this time period, 1902, 1903, as maximizing the contributions of European settlers coming into the state, then what was the contribution that Black civilizations were to make? And if they were to make a contribution, and he would be someone who would be engaged with and a critic of the Harlem Renaissance and other kind of new Negro Black movements in the US, trying to redefine Blackness in the United States, how were they going to be able to define themselves and their cultures and communities within this constricted context? And I spoke a little bit yesterday about understanding the United States history as a history of settler colonialism, which is this notion that when European settlers came over to the US, they established themselves first by eliminating Native Americans and replacing them as Native subjects. This is why you get phrases like the heartland of America is in the Midwest, and you get this notion of prairie and pilgrims, prairie pilgrimages and pilgrims themselves being the first new natives into a virgin territory and developing it into the United States. But then also they subjugated the labor and the citizenship of all non-white peoples. So they set themselves up in the US as first the new natives, erasing the memory of the old natives, and then universalizing themselves into the norm of the country, so that anyone who wanted to be accepted in American culture had to assimilate white civilizational values. And this context constrains the form of identity making within, for all non-white groups within this context. I don't think it requires a tremendous leap of the imagination to think of architectural discourse in a similar way, as a form of mental settler colonialism, where you have European ideas coming over, establishing the norms of good design and good design practice, insisting upon monumental architectures and a certain form of avant-garde formalism to take place. And that these practices really only benefit those white settler subjects who are able to form elite ties and elite status within this country and who can operate at that level. And if you can't operate at that level, then there's either something wrong with you individually, or you're written out of the discourse. Your work is omitted from these contributions. And so this kind of universalizing of the European perspective is one of the things that Du Bois is at war with here, trying to show that the double consciousness would not be necessary if the American Negro could simply be the American Negro. And if we could look at the modernity of the American Negro on its own terms. Another very influential and hopefully well-known paradigm is Edward Said's concept of Orientalism. And this relates to this kind of binary construction between East and West, which is parallel to the binary construction between Black and white that we tend to find in world cultures and hierarchies of world cultures. And he categorizes it as a kind of mental pattern that we project onto the world to make sense of things that are actually much more complex. Orientalism is a style of thought based upon the basic distinction between East and West as a starting point for elaborate theories, epics, novels, social descriptions, and political events concerning the Orient and its people. And what's really amazing to me is that you can write in into Google, you can search for Eastern civilizations or Oriental civilizations versus Occidental civilizations. And you will still find encyclopedias of art that categorize these things in terms of modernity and advanced civilizations and Eastern or backwards looking or traditional civilizations in a non-ironic sense. They're literally talking about places like China, Japan, India, as these places that are still beholden to this kind of backward looking orientation of the world in the same ways that Viollet-le-duc talks about it. So this idea of East and West, no matter how we complicate it, particularly things like Western architectural culture or history or civilization, brings along with it the baggage of this kind of binary construction that emerges. Now, Said was really interested in reassessing the cultures of the Middle East and the American foreign policies in those regions, their alliances with Israel over Pakistan, their positions in terms of the struggles of the demilitarized zone between these nations and the constant occupation of this demilitarized zone. So the real life implications that come from a superpower like the US supporting one side over the other in this national conflict. But we can think conceptually about the ways that the mind, in a typological sense, continues to try and reconstruct and reorder the categories that are these simplistic type categories that if we stopped using the categories and looked at the phenomena would break down, but we look for ways to continue to reconstitute those differences. There's another theory called the idea of racial formation. And this is given to us by Michael Omi and Howard Wynant. And they're really interested in the ways that American politics is influenced by the racial politics of its society. So people before this book came along would talk about the different voting blocks within the US. And they didn't always account for the ways that race and ethnicity would play into these voting blocks in the ways that these guys are doing it from a historical sense. And they're looking at it primarily from the post-war period, the 1960s, forward as social movements have affected American culture, bringing a greater awareness of cultural and racial solidarity towards certain groups, and how that then influences how people vote in certain blocks. these social relations are central to what they call the formation of US politics and public policy. And it's a critique of these colorblind ways of understanding political ideologies. A contemporary product of this line of thinking would be the book Brown is the New White, which looks at the ways that the changing demographics of the United States, particularly the rise of Latinx cultures in the US, and the decline of European American birth rates and the repopulation within that space is leading to a restructuring in the United States between those whites who find themselves thinking in either liberal or progressive strains, and those whites who find themselves aligned to more conservative and Republican strains. And this has to do with the idea of the expansion of whiteness over time. So to include groups like the Germans and the Italians, and then later the Jews. And now we're looking at the people theorizing the symbolic inclusion of certain Asian American groups and the symbolic inclusion of white Hispanics in order to maintain the white hegemony in the US. And the book Brown is the New Black says that there's an opportunity for radical and liberally minded whites to ally themselves and create coalitions with people of color in order to restructure the politics in the United States, to allow for the permanent passage of things like protective rights for LGBT citizens, protective rights for women's reproductive rights, protective rights for people of color from discrimination. And this is a real issue today. Like now we're facing the prospect of a Supreme Court that will be conservative for at least a generation, if not two or two and a half. We're facing the mass gerrymandering of political districts so that a minority of groups who belong to this kind of white upper caste can maintain their control by dividing those who are this new white category that we're talking about. Brown is the new white. And so it literally has implications for the future. What we see statistically is that most people are more socially progressive in terms of what they're willing to tolerate than our parents and grandparents were as well. But the voting patterns predictably show that older citizens, particularly older white citizens, they will mobilize to make sure that they vote. And young people and people just under middle age don't mobilize in the same ways, partially because they're not excited by the political candidates, partially because they don't have the things that would make them vote, like they don't own property, they don't have large families and things that they would want to protect with voting rights. And so we don't really know how this is going to play itself out, but we do know that race has become a factor. And ever since the introduction of the Southern strategy in the US by the Republican Party to divide and to pull off white working class voters from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party by pitting them against Black working class voters and saying that Blacks are unfairly leapfrogging them with civil rights gains and other forms of policies meant to restore some kind of equity within the system. These parties have been playing these people against one another in order to determine the future. So this is an interesting way of understanding how social policy works and the ways that racial formation literally happens in the present. So whiteness in 10 years will not mean what it meant at the beginning of the 20th century, and the groups that it included will not be the same. And there are people like Linda Martine Alcoff, who is a philosopher who have theorized that what white Americans need to do is they need to change the definition of whiteness from one that is invested within the roots of white supremacy in the US into something else. And if people take her on her advice, whiteness in 25 years might even be something completely different. So this idea of the contextualism of race is really quite interesting. And for me, it encourages us as architects and designers to be keeping track of the pulse of how these things work. Because the motifs and symbols that we might borrow from past typologies may not actually mean the same thing and emerge in the present in the very exact same ways. We have the academic field of cultural studies. There's also now the field of whiteness studies. And in whiteness studies, you have people in architecture, there are people like Diane Harris and in the UC schools, Martin Berger. And then in the field proper, we have people like Noel Ignatieff and Matthew Frye Jacobson, literally looking at the ways that the Irish, when they came into the United States and weren't considered white, how they became white. What was that process of including them within this umbrella? Cultural studies looks at things both from a global perspective and intersectionally, but also the ways that cultural practices, and particularly those of peoples of color, relate to these kind of global practices, from ideology to things like gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. And Stuart Hall is one of the most significant theorists in this space. One of the most important theories that he's put forward is this idea that race is a floating signifier. And as people have mentioned and commented earlier in the class, this is because race garners its meaning through the contemporary context. So when we think about American history, there was no such thing as a Black person until we gave them a category as slave in the US system. There wasn't such thing as a Native American until we gave them a category as an enemy combatant of the United States. And it is within these contemporary conditions that we start to define race. Why is it not then the case in architecture that we start to think this way as well? Why are we reliant upon these universal symbols as opposed to understanding contextually the meanings that these symbols start to operate? There's a host of texts that you might sort of use as reference points for yourself. Cornel West's book, Race Matters, sort of marks the beginning of him becoming a public intellectual from some of his more really close philosophical studies. And as well as Bell Hook's Where We Stand, the intersection between race and class, both of them understanding and reinterpreting the United States as a hetero-patriarchal space, a capitalist space, and one that uses race and what we would call today racial capitalism to establish much of its wealth. There's also the work of Paul Gilroy, which is really quite tremendous because he redefines transatlantic exchanges, not just as those occurring between Western Europe and the United States, but he adds the arc of the cultures and practices and beliefs that come from Africa to the United States. And so this idea of the Black Atlantic, combining Du Bois's notion of double consciousness with a reformulation of what modernity is in our present, helps us to understand that modernity was primarily defined through the European American or white experience. And when we change that frame, we start to understand different cultural legacies coming into play, from literature and music and culture to the ways that are different forms of colloquialisms that start to emerge within American society were borrowed from or appropriated from these non-white cultures and then written out of the history in the same ways that Native Americans were written out of the history. And then lastly, this field of critical race theory, which is really an important movement in the 80s and 90s, beginning in the discipline of law and looking at the ways that law enshrines certain racial privileges for some groups over others, and then sort of broadly applied as a way of critiquing the structures of power and the racial politics of the structures of power more broadly in society. So one of the first and most influential texts comes from Derek Bell, who outlined what critical race theory is. And here's a kind of preface in the introduction about what this means. He says, as Professor Bell noted in the introduction, the purpose of the text was to examine the law's role in concretizing racial differences, maintaining racial inequality, and reifying the status quo, an exercise that was necessary to understanding modern race relations of racial equality. And Bell and others are really interested in things like Supreme Court cases that literally were asked to define what it meant to be white in America. So people from Southeast Asian descent, people who were anthropologically categorized as belonging to the Aryan migrations that came from the Caucasus Mountains. Because they were not understood colloquially to be white because of their skin difference, they were written out of this definition. And it's interesting because you'll see the court flip-flopping using anthropology when it reinforces public perception and rejecting anthropology when it doesn't, which is a plain revelation that the meaning of race is contextual for those who are in power to maintain the segregations that they want, to restrict the privileges of elite status to certain subjects over others. And one of the most illuminating studies for me is Cheryl Harris's essay, Whiteness as Property, which goes back into the legal record. It traces the notion of who is a citizen, but also who is a subject, an individual subject, possessing something called, which in the legal term is called possessive individualism. So possessive individualism means that you as an individual possess all the rights and privileges that you have, and you determine how they can be used. It means that you can sell your labor on an hourly rate in order to receive wages. That's a conscious exchange of privileges. But some subjects at the founding of the nation did not have possessive individualism. Native Americans were not recognized as equal subjects. Blacks were categorized as slaves, so they were owned by someone else. And so Harris goes back and she traces the theft of land from Native Americans and the theft of labor from African Americans as the fundamental rights of whiteness, the segregated monopoly on possessive individualism during this time period. And then through her essay is like over 100 pages long. She goes from the founding of the country all the way through the civil rights period, looking at case law and comparing and showing the pattern, consistent pattern of reifying white privilege in the United States, legally as a way of continuing to block the social uplift of non-white groups in this space. And so critical race theory has been really important, both for providing us with a general lens of being suspicious and critical of power, and the ways that power reifies and continues to evolve in order to maintain these racial privileges. So today, for example, we might look at the ways that colorblind ideologies, where people say, I don't see color, I just see people and individuals. And this inability to see race and color actually works to reinforce differences, because we can't see inequality when we can't see race and its effect upon the general populace. And so on top of this, I would just add two essays, one by Sarah Ahmed and one by Linda Martin Alcoff, which looks at what they call the theories of racial embodiment from within the field of phenomenology in philosophy. And what they're trying to do there is, if critical race theory is really looking at the perpetuation of institutional racism at this kind of meta level, structural level within American society, they're looking at the ways that our social practices, who we marry, how we raise our children, how we live in our spaces, actually perpetuates at everyday sense, in a kind of embodied and social sense, what it means to be a racial subject. And they argue that we don't learn what it means to be white or what it means to be Black by studying the laws of this nation. We learn that by existing in social spaces and rubbing elbows with other people who are white or Black or other cultural groups. And that those norms, the biases, the stereotypes, the taboos, they get passed on from one generation, not just through law, but through actual practice. And in architecture, this has profound implications, because it allows for architectural historians to go back and to reconstruct the sense of racial embodiment that allowed and afforded certain types of subjects to have greater freedoms than others. And I try to illustrate it this way. So in an essay I wrote for Log, I talk about the sense of racial embodiment that one feels when they visit Monticello. And when you're in that space, that salon space that Thomas Jefferson designed, where he's borrowing from not only Palladian principles for the overall organization of space, but he's reviving Proto-Greek and Roman motifs and adding some American motifs to kind of localize his regional understanding of the space. You can appreciate in a kind of autonomous way what the form offers you. But as soon as a docent comes in who is dressed and reenacts the position of a slave in that space, now you can no longer understand those things in abstraction. Now you understand that those are the privileges of leisure that were only afforded by the free labor of Black slaves. And when you understand that those Black slaves were persistently housed in the basement of the building, when Jefferson had his most important visitors, put into invisibility, and along Mulberry Row, hidden within neoclassical type residences that hid any kind of overt display of Africanness or foreignness, then you understand how racial embodiment literally has a physical effect on the environment. The ordering of that environment and its space, the aesthetic privileging of certain symbols over others, and the erasure of subjects that were actually living in that space in order to afford us the kind of free apolitical contemplation that we'd like to have within architectural spaces. And so I like looking at this notion of racial embodiment because it compels us to think about what it means, or what it is like to actually be in that space, to put ourselves in the feet of non-race or raced subjects who might be of a different racial background than us, to understand the complexity of these spaces, not just as geometrical lines on a page, not just as forms and formal principles of an object, but as a lived reality that we pass down and condition for our generations and the generations after them. And so these are the principles of sort of race that I want you to think about and to think through. The notions of whiteness and blackness, how they're reified, both architecturally, spatially, in terms of social practices, to analyze a particular case study that I want you to think about. So let me stop this here so we can come back together. Okay, so that is actually like an hour, right? That's what we projected. What I want to do now then is I want to break you guys up into your rooms, workshop rooms, maybe about groups of 5 or 6 apiece. And I want to get you to do 2 things. You'll get an essay that you can thumb through, written by Lisa Findley, which talks about the history of Montgomery, Alabama, as both a space of the Confederacy and a space of civil rights resistance. And then she does a kind of preliminary reading of the Southern Poverty Law Center and its redesign through the firm Erdy McHenry. And so I'm going to give you a link to the architectural site on Erdy McHenry's website, and a link to this reading that you all can look through. And I want you to spend 30 minutes sort of looking through that material and thinking about how race conditions the way that we might view those spaces. And then we're gonna come together and talk about what it is that you found and how it is that you're reading that space. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your conversations. What kind of readings did you guys make of the building without any context? And then how it changed as you sort of accessed and picked out a little bit of the article here and there to get a sense of why the building was constructed the way it was, and what some of the formal gestures and landscape gestures were to situate itself within its landscape.
We talked about, just on the first reading of the building, we talked about kind of its like presence on the site, but then also just this like small separation at ground and its kind of elevation above ground. And then observing it from different angles, seeing how there were kind of different slopes and different approaches of the building. And then as we read, we became really interested in this like idea of like a project that needed to have defensibility. It's like something like, I don't know, I hadn't considered very much in modern architecture, that you need to build something that's like actually defensible. But, you know, then we kind of went back and looked at different perspectives and views and approaches, and kind of looked at this like what looks like almost a concrete bunker from the north elevation that it sits on, with very small windows at the base, and how it's unapproachable. And yeah, just kind of like really were amazed that that was the thinking that went into creating this project, to create like a kind of, not necessarily a public space, but like a place that's protected for people to do work. Yeah.
So before you read the article and figured out that the slopes and the landscaping at the base was for defensive purposes, how did you read the building? Like what rationale or what kind of logic did you apply to make sense of that?
I don't know. That's a good question. Like read the building, you mean, I don't know, help me understand a little more. I'm just
Well,
starting
just
out.
sort of as an object, a formal object. So like I get the sense that you understood it as, you know, there's a separation between a very heavy base and a top layer that floated above it, and there were some cuts and bifurcations within it. But as an object, just a formal object, like, did it make sense to you about that division? Were there things that were strange that elicited things about the building? I mean, like someone in the comments writing, it's like the building's on a pedestal, right? So like within like classical language, there is a kind of reason to do that kind of thing, independent of the need for defense, right? So I'm looking for sort of things like that. Like, what would be the formalist, like a purely formalist reading? Like, I'm launched on the Earth from outer space. I have no idea who these people are or what anything is. I just have the formal vocabulary that's been given to me through my architectural education, and I look at that building, and then how do I make sense of that building?
In our group, we looked at it more of a piece that stood out and more of a monument of that specific area, looking for a piece of change, just because it looked very different than the rest of the historical architectural type of the area. Just looking at the photo, it wasn't very much an aerial view, but an overglance of the piece, the building was very much physically different, and I understood it as a sense of a piece to recognize as important, or a sense of progression of a modern era.
So like in you know, the probably overused by now Venturi language, I am a monument, right? Like, this thing is like different, it's separate from its context, it's announcing itself, both in its scale, its materiality, the fact that it's lifted even above the plinth or the datum of the ground line. And so at a formal level, one can understand that it's sort of trying to make a physical presence for itself within the city. And the gesture of lifting itself up and the use of different materials is a way of contrasting itself with what's surrounding. So you might think that the institution, for whatever reason, wants to be different or to be distinctive within the space. Now, how did you guys understand the building afterwards? Now, we did get a sense of that the base was really a kind of way of modulating defensiveness within the building, to make sure that it was possible to protect oneself against people trying to come in and to use explosives and other kinds of things that had been used previously, arson and other elements. What about the rest of the building? How did you start to recontextualize your understanding of the rest of the building?
You said after the reading?
Yeah, after you started engaging with the reading. How did that start to, like, you know, tweak your thinking on the building?
So like one of the things that kept coming up in the reading was this sense of security, that again, the plinth was there as like a defensive as security. Then it went on to explain like the way that they treated the facade on that north end was because that's where most of the traffic was. So they covered it up and tried to have the least amount of penetrations. And then on the other side, like I can't really notice because of the images that we're seeing, but I was looking at the maps 360 of it, and like some of them are you can't see through them. So like even though they're being treated like visually differently, like that's materiality, it's still kind of doing that whole security mentality. Like it keeps bringing up security as like kind of one of its priorities. So that was just one of the readings that I got after doing the reading.
Another thing that I think was addressed was the idea of it as this watchtower, especially considering the different buildings that were surrounding the area, and that particular site being a site of kind of laws that were put in effect post-Reconstruction. And so that directly contributed to the existence of the building as a law office, like for Black people. Yeah, so a watchtower amongst these kind of institutional structures.
And I thought that point was, for me, was really interesting, because in a lot of discussions about modernist buildings and the use of the curtain wall. There's some discussion about transparency, but also a discussion about reflectivity, a way of like creating a dense urban space where the fabric kind of contextualizes itself by reflecting what's around it. But here the reading is the inverse. It's about being able to watch what's happening on the outside. And so in that sense, it formally and one would think spatially inverts the typical relationship one would think about when you think about why have a curtain wall of glazing on a particular building. I thought that was actually pretty interesting. What other points?
Something that I appreciated about putting the building on like pilotis or stilts was that it created the opportunity to make a visual connection to the church. And I felt like that creates like a kind of temporal lineage, a connection to its history and its present. And you can even go further and say it's also looking forward in that sense. So I really appreciated that opportunity that they took advantage of.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting as well. Like when you think about the building, it's elevated above ground. And formally, it's sort of two masses sort of held in parallel to one another. And then that one end kind of kinks itself a bit so that it's turning back toward the church. And you get the kind of cutout even in that space. So you get this kind of axiality that comes between the two. And in that sense, both the building as a watchtower and the building as creating a nod or gesture back towards the church, in some ways, it is literally bringing into view, into high relief, the elements of the plan that might not be seen or as connected spaces. You have the old Southern Poverty Law Center building, the monument, the Civil Rights Monument outside of that. On the other side of the block, you have the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and then you have this building on the Southern Poverty Law Center, which it like sticks out its neck literally to make that kind of connection, right? So they're trying very hard in a formal way to make a kind of connection between these spaces so that is recognizable. I want to give there's some time, maybe like 4 or 5 minutes to talk about other things that people notice before I share with you a kind of PowerPoint, both reviewing those points and then going a little bit more in depth into Lisa Findley's essay to talk about how it is that she produces a really, what I think is a very nuanced reading of the racial embodiment of the space and how the design progressed.
In my group, we were also talking about the kind of double consciousness that the building has, where it's like aware of the polarity of the area. And we're saying it has to defend itself, but it's also trying to welcome the people who are in support of what goes on inside of the building. And it's almost in contradiction, but and it kind of also has to dress itself for the area. As it was also speaking of the materiality and how it was expensive, but yeah.
So I like that comment. It makes me think of two things. So one is that if it were not for Reconstruction, the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church would not be there, right? So it was those few years of freedom post the Civil War time period that allowed for that to happen. So at the level of the urban design of the capital, there wouldn't be a visibility of double consciousness at all. It would just be a singular vision towards the Confederacy. And so the construction of the Southern Poverty Law Center kind of amplifies some of those elements of the civil rights movement that were brought into visibility. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the history to show that it's not just those buildings, but it was also the space of the street, the visibility of Black bodies in this kind of sphere, this public sphere, and the radically different ways that white citizens understood the Black populace during the Montgomery bus boycott, because of how visible they were and how many there were in that presence and during that time period. And in a way, the building, the Southern Poverty Law Center, tries to do something similar, which is not only to be a kind of striking presence, but to be kind of a permanent presence, not one that's sort of ephemeral and disappears over time, but one that remains within the city as a kind of a marker against itself. Okay, I want to share with you guys, these are really good points. Of course, I unfairly just gave you a little bit of time to spend with the text, right? If you could spend more time with the text, you'd be able to get more elements. But I just wanted to walk you through some of the features just so that we can look at them together. Let me share the right document. Okay, here we go. So this is a kind of just a basic review of the Southern Poverty Law Center by Erdy McHenry and Associates. I'm really going to try to both give you a summary of what was in the reading, but also think about it in the terms that I've been framing for this workshop session, which is thinking about notions of racial embodiment and thinking about notions of race as it has shifted its meaning over time, and its relationship to things like type and typology and form as a way of thinking through architecture. So here is the Southern Poverty Law Center building, and here we see a kind of white nationalist rally in front of it. What's interesting about this organization is that it was one of the first to start a kind of mail-in contribution campaign in the city, which made it both first a national organization and then an international organization. And today they continue their donations online as a digital extension of their collection of donations itself. And so in the context of the city, a lot of the people who live there and who work within the capital feel like the Southern Poverty Law Center is almost a kind of external body, a foreign body, even though all the people who run it live there and work there and purposefully decide to stay there. There was a moment when they were going to reconstruct this building that they had to decide whether they wanted to stay in Montgomery or if they wanted to go to a larger center that would help them with fundraising and also put them out of harm's way of people who've literally tried to burn the building and to cause harm. So they made a conscious decision to stay in place and to remain of Montgomery as opposed to staying outside. If you go to their website, what's really interesting, and these are old numbers, the numbers have increased since the Trump presidency, but you can go there and they have a map of the United States where they actually keep track of the different hate groups that are emerging within the state. And they give you a sense, they give you a profile of the different groups. You can click on the links and understand how long they've been established and in practice, how long they've been in the state itself, and what their core beliefs are. And these designations change as the standards and the beliefs in the organization change. Some groups go on the list, some groups come off the list. But what's interesting is that wherever I have taught, whenever I ask students to go and look at their state and to find out how many hate groups there were, there's a sense that there was an invisibility to some of them, that they didn't realize that there were this many in their particular locale. And so this is one of the services that they provide, along with legal representation to those who have become targets of different hate groups or those who are targeted by discriminatory laws that would allow for them that they would not otherwise be able to have for themselves. They couldn't afford the legal protections. And so these two things is what Southern Poverty Law Center does. And you can imagine, I didn't generate it here, but what the state of Alabama looks like and what the city of Montgomery looks like, and certain organizations that are practicing there, what they think about by being categorized as hate groups. Now, I'm going to start off with just a formal reading that inflects this idea of racial embodiment within the landscape. And then I'm going to work backwards to kind of give you a little bit of background on each of the different sites that are important here. But if you look at the plan for downtown Montgomery, it is literally a material record of the Confederacy, and then a material record of the civil rights movement. So the Capitol building itself was a building that hung the Confederate flag for many years. It took a state law to have it removed. And in addition to this, the state's governor worked with the Daughters of the Confederacy to have the first White House of the Confederacy moved from a different city and relocated permanently in Montgomery, right across the street from the Capitol building. And on the axis connecting the the first White House of the Confederacy in the Capitol building is a statue of Jefferson Davis, which essentially lionizes him as a military hero and a star politician, with making no reference to his works with the Confederacy or slavery at all. So sort of papering over that kind of legacy, which, I mean, before we condemn people who make Confederate statues and monuments for the South, just go to the US Capitol building and go into the statue room, and you'll see a lot of omissions of people who were there who participated in Native American removal and who were owners of slaves themselves. So this is a kind of continuing tradition within American governance. And then there's the old and new courthouse buildings that were there, where a lot of the civil rights cases were tried and discussed. And in terms of the civil rights movement, one of the main buildings, which you've likely read about, was the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which later became known as the King Memorial Baptist Church, because that was a church that took on Martin Luther King Jr. as their clergyman. And with the full knowledge that for much of his time, he would be either away from the church doing some of his activist work, or that it would bring greater attention to them within the downtown space. And this greater attention came, remember, before civil rights laws were passed, before there was the sense that you would be protected by police officers and you'd have federal officers helping to protect you. So they were taking a risk themselves, already being one of the only Black spaces on that avenue because of Reconstruction. The old and new Southern Poverty Law Center buildings, and then the Civil Rights Memorial designed by Maya Lin and placed on the east side of the old Southern Poverty Law Center space. So here's a map of that location. There's also an image in the text showing where all the buildings are. It doesn't indicate it here in the plan, but this is where the statue to Jefferson Davis is. And this is where the first White House of the Confederacy is located. Here's the new Southern Poverty Law Center building, the old one, the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the two state houses. Oh, sorry, here's the Civil Rights and old Southern Poverty Law Center, and here's the Baptist Church. So just to kind of collect the points that Lisa Findley isolated in her reading, she said that the building stands above its context like a watchtower over the city, which has kind of political implications when you have a civic organization standing taller than the state and federal buildings in that space. The northern facade is an open office wing with a glass facade to overlook the city. The southern facade has meeting spaces, library wings with reflective metal facing to reflect Civil Rights Memorial. The projecting building mass on the south facade creates a visual axis between the Civil Rights Memorial and the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and it's set on a concrete plinth above the street for security reasons. So it's important to note here that Lisa Findley both used the architectural term of plinth to describe this lower portion, but then related the plinth to the need for security to keep out those who would either create arson or other forms of security risks within the building itself. And so here you can see that little bent part of the building with the aperture trying to connect the two spaces of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and the Civil Rights Memorial and the old Southern Poverty Law Center. Here's a couple of sketches that were included in the reading from Erdy McHenry and Associates in terms of the issue of security, and then also the visual axes connected between these two. And there was a discussion about the ways that the open law library spaces would create apertures that would allow people who would be sitting in repose, reading case law about the defense of civil rights, looking down into the street and looking down at the memorial to the civil rights movement, the old Southern Poverty Law Center, which, as you saw in the image before, is the location of many protests and many protests against what it is that they're doing. So we get a sense then that these three spaces dedicated to the civil rights, at least in architectural form, not only preserve a particular legacy of resistance to the Confederacy, but do so in a concrete, permanent, material way. But even beneath this, there's a kind of spatial register within which we can understand how people relate to these particular spaces. So just a couple more images of context so you can get a sense of what this building is. When I was finishing my PhD at University of Pennsylvania, Erdy McHenry designed a student housing space, both for Drexel University and for Penn. And so it's interesting to compare this to that work. Those were also both tall buildings. There was a kind of plinth element on the street, but they operated in slightly different ways. So some of their motifs actually are starting to come into form through this particular project. And here you can see in these images from the law libraries overlooking the street, looking back onto the Civil Rights Memorial here, designed by Maya Lin. And this should remind you of like the arson that continually occurs to the sign outside of the death place of Emmett Till. So every year when they redo the sign, somebody comes by and takes a gun and shoots it up and destroys it, and has to keep putting up again and again and again. This is to kind of prevent things like that from happening. And then on the right side, you're looking at sort of the way the building kind of levels the people on the interior with the level of the courthouse. So they're not looking at it as a grand structure from the street, but they're looking at it spatially almost on equal terms with the most monumental elements of the building form itself. So I'm hoping that you get a sense here of the ways that space and the kind of bodily location within space, overlooking certain spaces, creating level grounds, becomes a really important rhetorical element for making a political statement about what is happening within these buildings. Both of them on the right side are related to the law, jurisprudence, but one being a volunteer organization with a national, international focus dedicated to civil rights, the other having official ties to the state, but for a long time being dedicated to the disenfranchisement of those civil rights. And now you have a kind of face-off here formally that one would see within the courthouse space itself. Here's some images of the construction of the slope, just to give you a sense of the depth of that plane over the plinth and how perforated and complex it is. Now I'm going to go site by site just to give you a sense of some of the individual locations here. So here is the contemporary view of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, largely just a congregational style church from that time period, mostly unmodified except for, you see some improvements here in terms of the architecture of the stair. Here you can see on the inside the kind of simple, straightforward, modest representation of this church in this space. So what's really important is the congregation of Black bodies in this location, the sound that one would hear as you walk by during services, the fact that on Sundays, this place, which is sort of resting from the official duties of the downtown, now gets filled with another kind of function that relates to the spirituality of the Black subjects in this location. And so there's a kind of permanent presence within this space that's very important. I just include this to give you a sense of how that it is memorialized within the state, both at the state level and the national level. And what's interesting is that both of these kinds of plaques that you see here also appear on the Jefferson Davis statue and on the first White House of the Confederacy. So there's a conscious effort in Montgomery to be preserving the physical legacies of both the Confederacy and the civil rights movement. Whereas in certain other cities, you get a kind of choice between those two legacies because of what it says about the present political composition of American politics. And in Stride Towards Freedom, one of the first biographies that King wrote about himself, he says this about the church: a solid black brick structure erected in Reconstruction days, it stood at one corner of a handsome square not far from the center of town. As we drove up to the church, I noticed diagonally across the square a stately white building of impressive proportions and arresting beauty, the state capitol. I was to see this imposing reminder of the Confederacy from the steps of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church many times in the following years. For my visit in January proved to be a prelude to my coming to live in Montgomery. And if you can recall in American history, the entire plan of the Civil Rights March from Montgomery to the Capitol as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge to walk up the steps of the Capitol building to hand a letter to the governor. There's a kind of reminder here of the physical context within Montgomery and the face-off that occurs in material form between the capital of the Confederacy and the church, which became the kind of social institution pushing forward the civil rights movement. And so you would find scenes like this one happening on the steps of the church, where you have face-off between the police, which is the official arm of violence. They have a monopoly on violence within the state, and Black protesters within the space. And for me, it's really important to remember that this building isn't just a building, but it was a space where these practices were held. And if you think about the substance and what made the civil rights movement successful was that they literally created rules of police engagement between the protester and what would happen when violence was exerted upon the protester. Those were spatial techniques. Those were techniques to handle the body within space. So the placement of the body within space was a very important element of this particular legacy within the civil rights movement. I talk about this as beyond the back way to describe the strategy of segregation in many southern cities, which is to give African Americans what was called the back way, or the least productive farm spaces in the city, which were also the most segregated and out of view. And so during the Montgomery bus boycott, you had people congregating from the back way to the main axes of the city. And there's an incredible visibility to Black bodies during that time period that showed their strength in numbers. Now, the popular telling of this story is that Rosa Parks got on the bus. She decided that she was too tired to move. She was arrested. The Black citizens came together and congregated around her and spontaneously led to this bus boycott within the city that over many months challenged the amount of money that would have been raised from the proceeds from people riding the bus. So showing the actual purchasing power of African Americans in this space. They gave in to the demands and got rid of segregated seating on the bus. You have images like this one where King is sort of standing in front of the bus that Rosa Parks sat in. And this is sort of how it's told. Now, the part that I think is interesting in terms of what we're talking about in the next few slides, but I'm going to question some of that narrative a little bit to give us a more complex sense of the spatial sensibility that's occurring here. What's interesting is that you got people together who owned cars and or who didn't know people who owned cars, but who would take the bus, start to walk to work. And there are these amazing images of Black congregations of people coming to and from downtown, from their backways, entering through white neighborhoods, and then going into the downtown area. And this visibility was a clear sign to the power structure of the city that not only were the Black community organized, but they were also working in solidarity with one another. And when these images started to show up in Life magazine and on television screens, it became a dramatic testimony to how many people in America were not satisfied with the inequality that existed in the city. So in a nation that likes to think of itself as a nation of individuals, you now have groups of people cohering around a cause for social justice. We see this happening again today with Black Lives Matter protests, with the types of protests against police violence in the summer after the murder of George Floyd. There's a kind of tradition within America, particularly if you are a person of color, that has to do with this notion of racial embodiment, how you would mobilize bodies within space in order to make a statement about where you think politics are. And this happens both within the streets and in the broader landscape, but also within buildings themselves. And this phenomena isn't always recorded in the physical form of the buildings. And so it's something that we need to be able to recuperate and return back to these spaces. Again, here's another marker for the Rosa Parks' Montgomery bus boycott. But what's interesting is that even within the civil rights movement, and people have written books critical of the civil rights movement, both for its masculinist notion of leadership, covering over the contributions of women of color, and particularly children. Children actually were the first people to be arrested in Montgomery because they established a walkout, and to intimidate them, they were thrown into jail cells. So we don't have a memory of those people. Instead, we lionize individual figures like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. But even within that kind of narrative, King, because he was educated in college through seminary, Rosa Parks, because she worked within the civil service, she was a light-skinned, respectable person. She had the cadence and the ability to speak in a way that would appeal to moderate and liberal whites. That's why she was chosen for that story. Even all the way down to comic books, right? That kind of popularizes for children as to what the official narrative was of this movement. But King himself says in his biography that she was not the first person to do this and to be arrested. He said, a few months after my arrival, a 15-year-old high school girl, Claudette Colvin, was pulled off a bus, handcuffed, and taken to jail because she refused to give up her seat for a white passenger. This atrocity seemed to arouse the Negro community. The inaction of the city and bus officials after the Colvin case would make it necessary for them in a few months to meet another committee infinitely more determined. Next time, they would face a committee supported by the longings and aspirations of nearly 50,000 people. So what was different between Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin? I mean, besides the obvious fact that Colvin is a young woman, she's a child, and Rosa Parks is an adult. Well, one of the things about Claudette Colvin was that she ended up becoming a teen mom. And so for the general public who would criminalize Black sexuality, particularly Black female sexuality, a young girl who became pregnant out of wedlock in her teen years was not somebody that would arouse the sympathy of white middle-class audiences. But Rosa Parks would. In addition, her cadence and her manner was much more Southern and much more common than that of Rosa Parks. And so there's a politics here. There's a colorism. There's a sense of respectability politics that's managing over the situation, which reveals for me the kinds of tensions within Black communities about how they want to represent themselves to the public, and whether that representation is considering the biases of the white gaze, or whether it's really about the consolidation within the Black community. Because if you remember from his biography, he said that the community was upset. They didn't care that she was a teen mom. They cared that she was a teen and that she was arrested and she was put through that trauma. And as being a mother, that would be even more infuriating for somebody who wants the public to look with sympathy upon Black motherhood and Black youth. And so there are stories that detail this for you. You can go to NPR and look at and listen to the story before Rosa Parks. There was Claudette Colvin, and they interview Ms. Colvin, and they talk about the respectability politics of that moment. It should also get us to think in relationship to this Bloody Sunday about the march from Montgomery to Selma across the Elm and Pettus Bridge, and the event that really started to elicit the sympathy of white liberal voters, which interestingly is really the violence upon Black bodies by the police state. And so it usually requires the drawing of blood before people will get up and do something about racial inequality and social injustice. And this is well documented. You can actually see some of the television footage that started to turn the tide and to make this not just a Southern Black Christian movement, but a national protest movement across the US. Now, if we think about the memorial itself, and remember it's here on the other side of the building, what's interesting to me is that this was a monument that Maya Lin started to design, or did design, shortly after the Vietnam Memorial, and she was asked by many civil rights organizations to do this. She recalled a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. where it said that justice would flow like a river. And she used that to create a timeline of the civil rights struggle, moving from the 1960s to the present day. And what's interesting is that she has a kind of fountain in the middle of it. And that fountain brings water over the top of the monument, which allows people to kind of see it as kind of like a peaceful reflection of the outside, almost like the reflection off of the glazing on the building. And then it kind of comes down and cascades over the bottom, and then the water kind of returns back and the cycle continues throughout. But the way that she designed it and the scale at which she designed it, people tend to naturally do what you see in this image here, which is they put their hand in the water, both to touch the letters and also to touch the water, and to both relate themselves to a particular moment that they see within the civil rights movement, but also to, as you can see in this image, very much like what she did at the Vietnam Memorial, see their reflections in this particular monument and to think of themselves as related to this particular image. And this is sort of explained in these two videos where Mylan talks about her own set of ideas. So I show this to you to give you a sense of the different moments of spatial embodiment, bodily occupation of space that's important for these buildings. And for us to really understand what the architectural gestures are doing, we have to do like Findley. When you look at the structure of her essay, she actually goes through and breaks down the history of the city of Montgomery and the placement of these memorials and the kinds of civic actions that people have taken before she talks about the physical orchestration of these buildings, building to building scale that occurs. So she's trying not to leave out the level of spatial occupation that happens at the level of the body, but to write that into the architectural story of what's happening at the building scale. And so for me, I find this essay to be kind of a masterwork in how it is that the architect can think through the notions of racial embodiment that are being explored within phenomenology today, and the ways that race and place come together at the level of architecture in terms of forms, formal gestures, and the materiality of the building itself. And I kind of wonder what kinds of readings we might produce of both canonical buildings in architecture and also of new designs if we were to take this kind of approach. Like, how would we rewrite the history of Monticello or the history of the state capitol building, which actually used Black labor to construct a monument of freedom and democracy? How would we rewrite the history of the White House? How would we rewrite the histories of many buildings that are either in tense racial contexts or that at a rhetorical level are symbols of freedom and democracy and equality, but employed very unequal means and exploited the materiality of racial capitalism in order to make themselves come into being. I think that we'd have a completely different history of American architecture. We'd have a completely different history of architecture and its role within social praxis, within politics, and we would pay lots more attention to the role that the body plays in embodying this space and the traditions that come along with those bodies. And my suspicion is that if we wrote that history, we couldn't write it from the universalist, monumental architectural perspective, that we would have to include the perspectives of people of color and those who were displaced by that grand narrative. So I offer that to you as a contemplation, a way of thinking about how you might reassess some of the precedents that you receive, primarily as typologies or as strategies simply to be imitated within a building, how you can enrich those references with other kinds of practices. And I'm just talking about bodily practices in this word tradition, but there were many rubrics that I tried to give you about race that would use it as a critical lens to rethink what architecture is about. So, I mean, like, I know that we have a half hour more, isn't that correct? So I wanted to leave time at the end, just so that it's not me proselytizing, right? But it's us discussing and perhaps even debating, how salient this might be for designers in contemporary design, what issues and difficulties might emerge as we start to think about this and contemplate this, and what gaps do you see within this kind of approach or this kind of research that need to be filled in order for us to really develop a kind of anti-racist practice within architecture.
I think through your both the lecture yesterday and today, something that has really kind of stuck with me has been this idea of conquering as creating this synthesis of architectural forms, and I keep thinking about like, what does reimagining like architecture outside of the lens of whiteness look like? And how are we able to reframe those parts of architecture that are rooted in conquest and kind of allow them a platform that isn't through the lens of whiteness? Mm-hmm. And is it even possible, as like we are specifically POC within, who have grown up systematically within America, are kind of just inherently through the lens of whiteness, just because that's the context with which we've been learning to view ourselves. And is that even a possibility?
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I have my own biases and thoughts on it, but I don't want to like prejudice anyone with that. But what I think is really useful in that question is the frame with which you're trying to understand the history of architecture, whether it's through the frame of the conqueror and the imposition of that narrative, or whether it's the frame of what we really want is a kind of an anti-racist, a pluralist practice. And if that's the goal, then how do we go about rethinking what it is that we have now in order to produce that as a kind of reality? And to me, what's really compelling about that story is that that kind of goal would be a discipline-wide goal. So it wouldn't be something that just people of color are contemplating. It would be anybody who wants to practice architecture would be contemplating, which is, you know, if you know that you become part and parcel of a kind of oppressive system or a kind of colonized mindset, then what do you need to do? What steps do you need to take in order to start to think outside of that space? And from my perspective, as I do more of this research, you know, I start to understand how deeply embedded practices of white supremacy are within the US context, and the ways that the buildings then can be appropriated, you know, from official federal styles to, you know, just like, I don't know, bike sheds and pieces of infrastructure that are placed in to harden patterns of segregation. So for an architect to really be anti-racist, it impresses upon me the level of which they'd have to be self-reflective in what it is that they're doing. And I guess, you know, us being both either architectural educators or architectural students, what kind of knowledge sets and what kind of critical tools should we have before we are, you know, set out to practice and, you know, declared a master of architecture and can go out there and actually shape the built environment? I know I kind of gave you a politician's answer, which is not to answer, right? But I'm hoping that we can discuss that as a class. I wouldn't want to just short circuit it with my viewpoint.
Maybe if I could just say something. Thank you so much again, Charles, for everything that you've shared with us. I wonder, with you, part of the practical answer about how one goes about rewriting histories and the futures of architecture and the discipline has to do with strategies and sort of methodologies for going about that. And I kind of noticed in your reading of that particular project, it divided into these two very distinct sections, the formal analysis and then something much more kind of contextual. And you're able to share really fascinating archival artifacts. And so I feel part of the work that's required to kind of perform this rewriting of the discipline and the practice is developing like strategies for intervening within archives. And of course, archives, kind of like buildings and sites, are stratified by occlusions and visibilities and absences, and they have the kind of grain in which obviously the hand of supremacism has been heavily influential. In your work, like as a researcher, how have you had to maneuver to like kind of read archives against that grain, or find in them things which were not immediately visible that enable these new kinds of readings?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really fascinating question. I think there's both a kind of personal answer, but also I think an institutional one. So really, like, I decided to go get a PhD in architecture because there were questions about the profession that were not solved for me through professional education, particularly around issues of both Black material culture and why it was so hard to integrate that within the discourses that were taught within architecture schools. But also because, and this isn't true at every school, but the kind of bifurcation that occurred between what was taught in the history courses and what was taught within the studios, and the kind of different language and sensibilities that seemed to predominate there, where one was really about, you know, we're just convinced, like it's a given truth that you're here to create monumental form, period. So either you do it and you pass or you don't. And not that it's a choice or that there's a kind of exploration of it. It's like, we're just training you to be the top 5% of our profession. And so I wanted to know more about that, sort of where that bias and expectation came from, and whether that was true of every kind of architectural academy within the US. And what's interesting is that there's a great diversity within the academy. There's the Black Mountain College, there are the HBCUs with the industrial educations, some of which house both Native Americans and African Americans together to create spaces for their own communities. There are places like Taliesin, where it's like the cult of the leader in the one place, and they kind of reproduce that signature style. And so the diversity with which, especially when we had like avenues to licensure, like apprenticeship. So you can actually learn things at the hands of someone who's a design builder, instead of going through, you know, kind of academies in the kind of French école sense. And so that on the personal level, I was just sort of dissatisfied with the ways that architects could not speak about Black spaces and Black traditions. And I wanted to understand why that was the case. And it led me to think about the racialization of the discourse as a whole. But as I was doing the PhD and afterwards, it's made me think about the fact that architecture has this weird kind of relationship in the professional school world, where it's both trying to be kind of humanist art and it's part of artistic production, as well as a kind of technocratic professional kind of extension. And so because of that, it has given itself the responsibility of manning and maintaining its own history. And I don't think we do a good job of that. And I say this both like in terms of architectural academies, in terms of how we train adherents, you know, students of architecture. I think the level of history that we give them, if we stick to the kind of really outdated survey model, which is really just an emulation of the old learn the 150 buildings of the canon so you can be a good designer, as opposed to how to make history, which is what these history courses should be, so that people can come in and be given the tools to not only make buildings, but to mine the kinds of paths that they need to make their buildings. And I think if we rethought history in that way within a professional context, then there would be an interesting kind of feedback loop between those spaces that does not occur presently. But then I also think that like since the year around 2000, 2005, with the increasing digitalization of architectural education and the types of people that tended to attract, versus the previous generation of architects who were kind of postmodernists, and they were like bad philosophers, bad writers, bad poets, whatever, right? They had a toe in, at least in that space. They were never quite masters of it. And then the difference in background and the difference in sensibility and bias that this brings. So I find a lot of schools, and even like a lot of the state schools in the middle, trying to keep up with the avant-garde schools. They're hiring the people in the digital fields and trying to fill the NAB requirements, and they're creating more courses that are no longer theory courses, but they're techniques courses. And so there's even less and less space in the curriculum to take outside courses that might give you that history, and inside of the profession that are providing that history. And so in a sense, I feel like we both have an explosion of architectural historians who are being really daring, bringing post-colonial, settler colonial frames, critical race theory frames, and feminist frames to practice with no kind of institutional base within architectural education to make that connection. And I think it's because we continually reify certain forms of design, because that's what's still respected by institutions like the Pritzker Prize and other elements that tend to reify and set the standards of what that is. So I think at an institutional level, we have an issue in terms of who's recording that history and how that goes back into the discourse. And that, for me, was the prompt for me to go out and to find these archives. And what I found as I was looking at these archives is that, and it's really interesting, and I won't name names, but all the lead historians of Viollet-le-duc, Gottfried Semper, Louis Sullivan, and not William Lescott, so some of them were mostly in Germany, so I didn't get to talk to them in person. All the people that I spoke to in person knew about the racist past of these individuals. They knew about the racial frameworks that they were using, and they didn't write about them. They didn't write about them. And so I was like, well, why are you not giving us the full story? Why are you not telling us what role race theory and race thinking took in these kind of discourses? And it's because we are at a stage where, like Thomas Jefferson studies were at the turn of the century, before we could openly say that Sally Hemings and her children are part of the Jefferson family, right? And that we can accept the kind of racial disparities that are part of the great man theory of time, and not sort of whitewash them to be these heroes that we don't have to problematize in terms of what it is that their politics, racial politics, gender politics, whatever it is, does on their practice. And so in a way, I feel like we've been robbed of this history. And so, I'm starting with the kind of the sacred cows of architecture, just to give us a real sense of what that is. Only because, like, what I'd really like to do is focus on historicizing Black material culture in a way that's not segregated within vernacular studies or folk studies or something else. But that requires that we do tremendous violence to the definition of architecture that predominates within the Architectural Academy. And it means that, it doesn't have to disappear, but it cannot be at the top of the pyramid. It cannot monopolize all of our time and interest, because that prevents us from asking the questions we need to ask to get to the real root of the issues of racial inequality within our field. Because architecture is still always going to be expensive. It's still always going to take a lot of time. And because the people who tend to have the money want the buildings to speak of them and their own institutions, unless we have a lot of radical institutions in America, they're going to represent the kind of capitalist, technocratic mindset that allows someone to accumulate billions and billions of dollars of wealth. So if that's the only realm that counts in architecture, then a lot of the crazy experiments that have been happening in Black communities, communities of color, poor communities, communities that don't use the language of architectural formalism as it is generally rewarded, those get disappeared in history. And so I found that not only do the scholars who have researched this previously know this, but there's a rich archive in local newspapers, magazines, advertisements, journals, institutional minutes. Like there's a kind of archive that one can recover if you diversify your sources as not just being the correspondence of the architect and the client and their drawings. And you think beyond that kind of autonomous disciplinary history to relating it to the social context. I am 100% convinced that if that was the mode of history that we taught in architecture school, every single person we worship would have some kind of complex, problematic element in their history. But then we'd learn to deal with it. We learn to actually anticipate it and try and manage it within the design process, not just imagine it's not there by treating it like an autonomous formal exercise. So for me, that's how I came to it, right? Like the comedy of errors in my own architectural education, looking for and trying to legitimize this mode of practice. But this is a hidden secret within our profession. There are really well-placed historians who know this already. The reason that it's not being shared with you is because they won't share it, because they don't want to disrupt the discourse that is the dominant discourse that rewards certain types of designs and certain types of people. So you're pushing against a power structure of the haves who don't want to give up what they have, and that's the real issue. It's the personal, interpersonal costs, not the potential field that we could inherit. And so I've tried not to frame this as a kind of problem of people of color or a problem of including African Americans, but it is a problem of white hegemony and white supremacy within our field, because that's what it is. And if that goes away, it won't just be Black people or people of color who benefits. We get a completely different field. We get a completely different way of thinking about things. And we don't have to throw away everything in the basket, but at least it no longer serves white supremacy. And that's no longer the dominant model within our practice. So I think that like everybody who comes to architecture school, like unlike the model of education where you're kind of brainwashed to think that you didn't know anything about architecture and you're learning these new principles, you're actually bringing things with you. You're bringing an archive. You're bringing a set of relationships, a set of knowledges, cultural knowledges, and that should be respected and fostered. And when we're in that space, I think naturally this stuff will start to happen. And then maybe in the same ways that mass movements change politics in the US and dissenting judgments in the Supreme Court become laws, that will start to happen within the Architectural Academy. At least on my optimistic days, that's what I think could happen.
Hey, Charles. Do you believe that modern science is problematic, and should architecture stop looking to nature?
So this is an interesting question. I wonder if it's sort of a loaded question, but I'll try and approach it.
Sorry.
In terms of the critique of architectural organicism that I've made. At the heart of this question, I think, is another question, which is one that I often entertain in terms of people's disquiet with my critique of American politics, constitutionalism, or with the formal rules of architecture, which is, can they ever be neutral? Can they ever be just tools? Or are they always problematic? And for me, I take a sense of a kind of a culturally informed understanding of our institutions, including science. And there are lots of people who are writing in the history of science and philosophy of science who tell us that in every age, the things that actually convince us which theories are the truth are not necessarily the results of experiments, but it's the elegance with which one is able to frame those experiments within a kind of argument or a theory. And that it's the beauty and elegance of that theory that convinces us. So, you know, E equals MC squared and all these other elements, there's an art to the ways that these scientists are packaging them for the audience. And that art is really rooted in a kind of contemporary knowledge of place. And so for me, I don't think that science or even organicism is inherently bad, but I do think that it tends towards certain extremes when it's used either without a very deep knowledge of that space. And at least from my perspective, architects really thrive on misreading things. Like they misread scientific theories and find associations between things. And, you know, like some of it is partially true, but some of it is also like personal, willful because of the personal project of the architect. And I think that there needs to be a check on that. So for example, today, most biologists will tell you that race doesn't exist as a real thing. But they'll also tell you that, some of them, that we still need it to track the effects on populations, and that this is a kind of problematic space that we're in. And what's interesting as well is that the same scientists who invented the genetic sequences or decoded them and gave us the ability to trace like our lineages, right? So like these 43andMe and these companies that take your data and tell you who your relatives are and where you come from. A lot of them tell you that because of the partial data sets that we have and the people who are most compelled to give up their data into these spaces, that it can sometimes repeat the misreadings of history that we have already because in this new kind of space. So we can actually reify and reinscribe the essentialist narratives of the past with contemporary science. So I don't think science is by any way like a tool that doesn't have problems. But I do think that like it requires a historical ability to historically contextualize. And I guess the only thing I really wish architects would do, especially the ones who love nature as a kind of model, is to at least read the treatises of the 18th and 19th century and not just historicize from the 1960s forward or 1970s with the experiments at MIT and their labs there and with people like with text like a pattern language and all that kind of stuff. Like not just to, that's not as far back in history as we need to go. Like if we're talking about something that is borrowing from the biological metaphor, we need to go back to at least the 19th century, late 18th century to avoid repeating the essentialisms. And I guess I would feel better about it if I can go into a review where someone's doing kind of computational project that's based on a natural model, and I don't feel like I'm in 1865 or something. Like I'm just hearing the same argument. Then I would think that we've done what we need to do to get them not to repeat that mistake. So I don't know if I answered your question. I hope I answered your question.
A great answer. Thank you.
Charles, thank you so much for your lecture last night and for today's workshop. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow's workshop. Something you just said just a few moments ago about, I really appreciate about the sort of in response to John's question about the archive and how the archive is kind of within all of us, and that rather than coming to architecture school to learn only pre-existing knowledge, but rather the idea that every student, every faculty member, everyone that's part of that institution is creating that knowledge. And that resource is sort of a distributed thing that's constantly in flux. And something that in the text by Sarah Ahmed that you shared with us, The Phenomenology of Whiteness, she's talking about the institution. She defines it as a kind of the repetition of decisions that are made over time. And she's also talking about the word recruitment and the calling and who do we call and why is it that we repeat the calling of some and not the calling of others. And I just think that you just provoked really to me a wonderful thought about how we are all responsible for shaping these institutions. And the institution is us. It's not something that exists outside of us. And I thank you for that.
So your comment actually reminds me to emphasize the fact that in that same essay by Sarah Ahmed, when she's talking about the fact that racial embodiment is really the result of decisions that we make again and again, the habits that we take on with one another, but that it also shows up in our level of discomfort. So like when someone who is white enters an all black space, there's a sense that I am the only thing that's different here. And vice versa, like when a person of color enters a predominantly white space, there's a sense of like, I may need to be careful about how I comport myself or what I say. Like that these levels of discomfort aren't just these individual responses to situations, but they're actually habituated responses to being in spaces that are tailored for certain types of bodies or other types of bodies. And that, for me, what's useful there is that if we think about that in the terms that you just discussed, which is that we all bring archives to a place. And when we feel free to develop those archives, then that's a kind of space that encourages pluralism. But when we feel like we need to shut down that connection or that knowledge, there's a sense of unease and discomfort. There's a sense of struggling that we feel in a bodily way that relates to this notion of racial embodiment that she's talking about. And I mean, like, I don't know what's happening in your institution, but at my institution, we're doing this kinds of series of workshops on diversity and inclusion, and the ways that they kind of explain it and try and get people to become sensitive to it. It almost feels like you're in psychology class or something, and you're really trying to like not hurt anyone's feelings. But if we understand that unease of feeling, not as like, I offended this individual, but that there's a deep institutional practice here that shapes what it is that we think of as normal and what is not. And certain bodies fit within that space, and certain bodies stick out of that space. Like if we use Sarah Ahmed's frame, I think that it lends a gravity to those kinds of considerations that are very easily dismissed otherwise. And it allows us to a kind of metric to gauge how well we're doing as an institution in terms of enabling our students and our faculty to develop that kind of intelligence that they come in with. So I really appreciate that comment. And I don't know, I keep revisiting like both Sarah Ahmed's essay and Linda Alcoff's essay for those reasons. So I think like we're about 5 minutes to close, is that correct? So I don't know if you want me to close out the class, or if you, I don't know, like what happens at this point in the program.
I don't know. What do we want to do? I mean, there is no, we can shape this. It's, I think we should, yeah.
Question, if I may. So I know you brought up Viollet-le-duc, and it's kind of new to me, but like he has some like Aryan, well, he's got some things that may be problematic, but if I were to look into it more, like how his theories of evolution, and at the time evolution was even put on people, like different races were different stages of evolution. And that time, that's how it was done. I'm sure like that tainted his work and his theory. What would be a good, like, if I wanted to look into it more, what would be a good sources to look into, or a good framework or advice that you have for that kind of exploration?
So there's an essay written by Irene Chang in the book Race and Modern Architecture, where she reviews the structuralist interpretations of race and style throughout the late 18th and 19th centuries. And that's a really good introduction to it. There's also several writings by the architectural historian Laurent Baridon, Laurent And there's an essay about his domestic ethnography. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's inside of an architectural design special issue from the 1970s. And all of those would give you a sense of how he integrated race theory into his domestic ethnography. But if you want the simplest, most straightforward reference on this, look at the Benjamin Bucknall's English translation of his text, The History of Habitations of Man in All Ages. And you can literally read that book in a sitting, and you'll get how he's relating racial typologies with vernacular typologies, and the worldview that he comes away with in that text. That's probably the best crystallization of his reading of race and style in architecture.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions before we close out? Because I do think we want to close out on time. I have many questions, but I'm going to be quiet for a little bit. Charles, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who participated today. This was really good. I hope people can come back tomorrow and there will be a kind of continuity. I think it would be wonderful to be able to continue to this process together. So we'll be back at 10 o'clock tomorrow, and same Zoom link. And there's a piece that is on Teams, and it's also been emailed. It's a piece that Charles has written for Moving Beyond Repair, Construction and Revisionist History of Architectural Modernity at MoMA. Please read it. I think we're going to and as well as probably the Ahmed and the Gooden piece too, if you haven't, because they'll probably emerge in the more fluid conversations tomorrow.
All right, thank you guys for spending the morning/afternoon with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.